So ideally, cryptography concepts will entail the various building blocks of security. We need to understand what cryptography is. When you're talking about cryptography, we also need to talk about cryptocurrency, right? Because when you securely transfer bitcoins within the blockchain, then we normally refer to that as cryptocurrency. So the term cryptography is actually a security component that ensures secure communication within a blockchain. So first, we need to understand the goals of cryptography, or rather, why do we need this particular cryptography within the blockchain? Now, when you talk about security, ideally, you need to understand the triad. Triad simply means you need to understand the confidentiality, integrity, and authentication, and of course, availability, right? So these are three components that when you talk about security, you have to mention, right? Confidentiality, we need to ensure that no unauthorized user, or rather node, that should be able to read the transactions or what is being communicated within this particular blockchain. And of course, you have integrity. If two nodes are communicating, for instance, we need to ensure that whatever is being passed from one node to the other is the same, and there's no kind of modification of this particular data, or no any other third party can be able to alter this particular data. And the communicating nodes should actually be able to understand who has sent this particular data, or other transaction, or who has initiated this particular transaction. So we talk about authentication. So if it is node X communicating with node Y, node Y needs to understand that this particular data, the originality of this data is actually from node X. So these are some of the primary goals of cryptography concept. So we also need to understand other goals. We also need to look at non-repudiation. For instance, let's say something happens, and like we looked at smart contract last time, we talked about legal issues, right? That can be able to maybe change how we do transactions. Now, that is what we refer to as non-repudiation. Are we in a position to actually determine or take this particular transaction in case of something, if something happens? Can we have another third party who can be able to bring some kind of agreement, or rather, can we be able to showcase that this particular transaction was authorized, right? So it's just like some kind of a proof after transactions have been made. We also have the issue of double spending, right, which can also be minimized. We saw how this is actually captured within blockchain. When multiple parties are involved, like the various nodes, right, we need to ensure that this particular parties or other nodes communicate securely. We are also going to look at the concept of public, or rather keys, right, where participating nodes needs to share some private keys. Now, these keys provide some kind of anonymity, so that we can always confidentially share some kind of what resources. Now, these are not the only goals of cryptography. We have other additional ones. We can bring them on board based on what we discussed. So confidentiality, as I mentioned, only the intended receiver or sender should be able to understand the content of this particular message, right? So we are going to introduce some terms such as encryption and decryption. So the sender should have some kind of algorithm or other key that enables them to encrypt this particular message that is being transmitted or shared, and the receiver should be able to have the right key to be able to decrypt these particular messages. Ideally, when you talk about cryptography, you have different forms of securing data that is in transit, like use of public keys, private keys, use of hash, right? We are going to mention this. And authentication, I've mentioned that the participating nodes need to confirm each other's identity. Is it true that it is X that has sent this particular data, right? The integrity of this particular information should not be tampered with. Ideally, we should not, or otherwise transactions should not be altered. Once it has been approved, then it should be the way it is. And of course, the issue of availability, I've mentioned this. All the transactions, or rather all the nodes that are participating within a blockchain should be able to see what each other can be able to see. If 5 nodes can be able to see, maybe let's say we have 10 nodes or 10 blocks, right? And only 3 users can be able to see, and the other users cannot be able to see, then that is an issue that needs to be dealt with, right? So if we can't be able to, or other participating nodes cannot be able to view the contents of a transaction, then there's a problem, right? And there we normally talk about forking, right? Maybe next a week I might introduce that particular concept of forking. So these are the essential goals of cryptography. I know I've been talking about cryptography and maybe we don't understand what it is. So this is the process of converting a message in transit into a particular secret code, right, called cipher. Cipher is actually some kind of altered, or rather alphanumeric text, right, that really you can't be able to understand, right? And changing this particular encoding messages back to regular text. Ideally, cryptography is about encryption and decryption, right? So encryption here is a conversion of the original message that is being sent into ciphertext, and then the receiving node should be able to decrypt this particular ciphertext into plain text so that they can be able to understand. Now, the process of converting, or rather decrypting and encrypting this kind of text requires some kind of algorithm, right? So this algorithm can be performed using symmetric or asymmetric kind of cryptography, and we're going to look at all these. So it's all about keys. Now, what are the maybe importance of having a key anyway? Let's say you have some 5 sets of key. One to lock your door, one to lock your gate, maybe one to open your school drawer, right? So you know the importance of a key. If someone gets hold or access of your key, then there are high chances that they are going to use that particular key to do what? To open. So an authorized user, if they get your key, they can use it to steal your information, right? So what you're saying is this: we need to keep these particular keys in a safe place. There are those keys that we can share, right? Normally, you can always have maybe 2 padlocks. So just in case of anything, maybe you can give your family one key for the one padlock, and then maybe reinforce the security using another padlock, so you keep another key for yourself, right? So this particular key that you normally share with the rest of the people is what we are going to refer to as a public key. And the key that you remain with is what we refer to as a private key. This set of keys perform different tasks. So what you have just mentioned is what you can see from this particular diagram, right? So you are typing some plain text. You want to send this particular plain text. So it needs to be encrypted into some ciphertext using some keys. Then you can see the end recipient can always get to decrypt this particular ciphertext into some plain text. So you can see the plain text was, my name is Alice Jack, and once it has been decrypted, it gives the same text. Now, apparently, not everything always go as it seems. It's not that easy process. Someone can get hold of this particular encryption keys, as I'd mentioned, and they can maybe redirect the conversation to some rogue. It could be server, or rather some man in the middle, right? So we are going to see or look at a scenario how you can be able to reinforce these particular cryptography options, right? So who is this who wants to disturb us, right? Next time, use your official email address. So why do we need cryptography, right? Ideally, what I've mentioned is that communication happens in very unsecure areas such as the internet, right? So we really need to ensure that we secure the data that is being transmitted. As I mentioned, not everyone that uses these particular channels are good people. We have the hackers, we have people who can always have malicious intention of getting hold of this sensitive data, and that's why we need cryptography. A good example is the use of internet, right? Especially when you are doing some purchase online using your credit card, right? So those particular websites, they normally have some layers of security, and these like, for example, the secure socket layer, right? You also have the TLS, right, or the SSH, right? These are form of cryptographies that are being appended on top of the website, so that at least when you're doing your transaction, the confidentiality of the information that you're using is actually maintained, right? So cryptography doesn't just play in one angle, right? It is something that is replicated across different platforms, and that's why I say it's not only within the blockchain technology. As long as this technology has some way of sharing information or other data, right? As we have mentioned, also we need to maintain the integrity, right? So once you have maybe provided your information, right, we need to ensure that it is the right, or rather the right website is the one that you actually is capturing your details, so that someone cannot alter. Let's say you wanted to just withdraw, or rather purchase an item worth 10,000 shillings, right? And maybe through some malicious ways, someone can be able to alter this particular information, maybe to make it look as if you're purchasing goods worth 20,000 shillings. So this is what we refer to as integrity. So we don't need to have a scenario where some third party can be able to alter this kind of data. But yes, we are also going to look at a scenario where someone can be able to tap, eavesdropping, right, into this communication and capturing this particular confidential, or rather private data, into some kind of form we refer to as replay attack. So there are different forms of attack, and we need to use this particular cryptography strategy to be able to thwart these particular malicious attacks. So what are the building blocks? Ideally, as we have mentioned, at least we now understand what encrypting is. We now understand what decrypting is. We are still going to understand more about how this encryption happens. And these are two nodes, right? So let's assume that on the left side we have node A, on the right side we have node B. It could be also users, right? As long as there are two items or things that are communicating across, right, we can always have some form of a message being passed, and we have to secure it, right? So we are going to look at asymmetric encryption and decryption, and symmetric encryption and decryption. These are just terms that allows us to understand how this particular algorithm of cryptography works. Now, in a blockchain environment, we use two main cryptographic concepts. That is hashing. I think in our second lesson, I mentioned about how important hashing is. Before a particular block is confirmed or created, the last process is to actually append some hash, right? So hash, these are characters that actually cannot be used twice, right? And we can always use them to see the pattern of how blocks are created. Then also we have the digital signatures. If, for example, a node that is creating a particular transaction, or rather it wants to share copies of a ledger, this node needs to append its primary, or rather not primary, but a private key to this particular ledger, right? So that all those particular nodes that has a public key can be able to see that this particular ledger originated from a particular node, so that they can be able to decrypt and see what has been shared. So this concept whereby a particular node uses its private key, right, to append some form of signature, that is what we refer to as digital signature. Anyway, we are going to look at it in a few. So yes, these are the three forms that we are going to talk about: symmetric cryptography and asymmetric cryptography. Now, as you can see, a hash is a form of cryptography that ideally captures some block of message, then converts that particular block of message into some unknown characters. It's just the same concept of encrypting the message, as you can see. Then you have symmetric. From this particular diagram, you have to understand that symmetric encryption, the participating nodes should use the same key, right? As you can see, in symmetric encryption, the same key is used. So normally what happens, before sending data in this manner, all the participating nodes first need to share the key before any kind of message is sent. Then we have asymmetric encryption, where we need two forms of keys, right? So you can have a public key and a primary key. Now these two forms, or rather three forms of, let me just talk about them as encryption. They have their own pros and cons, right? As we are going to look at. Now, as you can see from this particular diagram, we have already mentioned the concept of encrypting. So there's some kind of algorithm that are normally used, and these are a set of keys that can always be used to encrypt a particular data, right? So if two communicating devices, in our case I can see it is Bob and Alice, so they want to share some confidential information. So what is happening here is that the communication, or rather sending of data, happens using symmetric key. So before transmitting data between Alice and Bob, or these are just examples. It could be one node, node A and node B, right? So it's not a must that there should be users, right? So they have to first of all share the key before transmitting this particular data. Then we can also bring the concept of using both public key and private key in what we refer to as asymmetric cryptography. So symmetric cryptography uses a common cipher technique referred to as monoalphabetic. Just allow me to maybe mention this, because we have different algorithms that are normally used, but it's beyond the scope of our discussion. We just need to understand the concept of how keys are used to encrypt data. For those of us who have gone through cryptography class, you will be told the various forms. But you need to know that monoalphabetic is a very secure, it's more secure cipher option compared to the others like block ciphers that we have, right? So ideally, here the substitution of characters happen so that we have the ciphertext, right? Then you convert or decrypt this particular ciphertext back to plain text. So in a nutshell, in a symmetric key cryptography, this is not really very secure, as you're going to see. Symmetric key cryptography is not really secure because they're using the same key, right, to encrypt and decrypt. You can imagine if, for example, they share this particular key before communicating. If someone holds or gets a copy of this particular key, so when they're transmitting the data, someone can actually see the content, right? So yes, it is used. It also has its advantages, right? Like you can use it to transmit bulk data, right? Public key cryptography, or we can always talk about private key cryptography. Depends with which option is being used here, because we also have digital signatures, right? So here the sender and the receiver do not share secret key, right? So there are two different keys here, right? So public encryption key is normally known to all. So when you talk about known to all, is sharing the public key across different nodes. So everyone has a copy of this particular key, so they can read the transactions or look at the details of a particular ledger. But ideally, for anonymity purposes or security, you should remain with the private key. So private key can always be known to the sender only or to the receiver only, depending on who has initiated this particular transaction, right? So ideally, the message that is being transmitted here is normally captured as M, and some algorithm needs to be calculated, which we are really not going to do at this particular point. So we need to understand that one key should be public when you're doing or having public key cryptography, and the other one should be private. So if you happen to share your private key, especially when you are doing some kind of Bitcoin transaction, so you release your private public key, and of course you also release your private key, so people can always withdraw money from your wallet, which should not be the case, right? So one thing that you need to understand about this is that the private key needs to be kept in a good way. So private key can be also seen as some secret key. We also have public key, right? So private key has been there for a while, right? And public key was brought into perspective just to reinforce some form of security. And that's why in any given communication within a blockchain, we need to have both the the private key and the public key. I kind of use private key, primary key word a lot because I talk about databases at some point. Now, so private keys are some just kind of random characters that are normally formed, right? They should not be known to the attacker, not only to the attacker, but any other person, right? I think that is clear. So when two participating nodes, it could be users or it could be computers, right? If they happen to share the key, it should be done securely. It should have some kind of algorithm, right? Or rather, some kind of keys that provide some random integers. It should actually be completely secret. Maybe we can ask ourselves, where do we get these particular keys, right? Because anyone can be able to process and have these particular keys. So we're going to see the intermediaries or the bodies that are mandated to come up with these public and private keys, right? So as I'd mentioned, I just gave a case of Bitcoin. So if you ever lose a private key to your Bitcoin wallet, the entire contents of your wallet could be vulnerable, right? So we need to ensure that our private key is never shared. A public key is a kind of a key that you can share with everyone, right? And that's why you can see from the diagram, Ali's public key is shared with everyone. But when it comes to decrypting the message, the private key is only used with either the sending or receiving nodes, right? So that's the difference of public and private key, right? So public key, anyone can get access to that. But private key, no need of an authorized access that should be granted, right? So when we maybe take a look at the blockchain, that particular node that initializes or broadcasts the formation of a ledger, or when they want to share copies of a transaction, it normally, first of all, broadcasts the public key across the nodes, right? So every node or every user within the blockchain understands that it is node X that has this kind of a public key, right? But the private key remains with that particular sending node, right? So that's how it can always be applied. We can also use both the public and private keys at the same time. And here is where digital signatures come in, right? So when you reinforce the two concepts, we have the hybrid encryption, right? A scenario where we use both is, for instance, when we are performing some kind of symmetric encryption. We have said that symmetric encryption is a weak or provides some kind of weak security, right? So what happens is that, first of all, we can share the public, rather we can encrypt, or rather share the private key using the symmetric encryption, right? And for the participating nodes, therefore, they can always know that this particular message that is being transmitted across the board can or has originated from a specific node or a user. I know I'm a bit confusing here, right? So ideally, when you want to use asymmetric encryption, this is the use of both both public and private keys. For the symmetric, we use the same type of keys. When it comes to utilization of the processor speed, we say that symmetric encryption is faster. I don't know who can tell us why. And the symmetric encryption is slower. Ideally, it's faster for symmetric encryption because they don't have time to maybe look at the source private key, so they only share the same key. So it happens very, very fast, and that's why it's good for transmission of bulk data. But for the asymmetric encryption, we need to form two types of keys, right, before communication happens. And of course, there's a need of the destination node to confirm if this particular data originates from the sender that claims to have sent it. So ideally, symmetric encryption takes time, right? Takes time to create, so it utilizes much of the processor power. Hashes, they use different algorithms or hash functions. Like we have different categories of hash functions. The one that normally is used is the SHA 256, right? Ideally, this is just some way of capturing data and transforming it into some random integers so that someone cannot be able to really tell what has been sent. And you can see an example here being given, like the quick brown fox did some crypto, right? What you need to understand with these particular hash functions, they produce only one instance. That is, we normally refer to it as a nonce. Yeah, they are not the same. So every time that a hash function creates a hash, it should be a unique, so that there is no any time a given block has the same hash function, or rather not hash number as the previous one, right? So that one reinforces security in a block chain. So hash are used to improve the integrity of the message that is being passed. We have looked at confidentiality, integrity, and we are also going to mention about the authentication, right? So how is Alice and Bob going to determine that whatever is sent is the same, right? Or the same, whatever is received is the same as what was sent, right? So integrity here, hash can always ensure that the data that was sent is actually not manipulated, right? So we need to understand the different categories of hash functions that are normally used. Like in this particular case here, let's say this is Alice who wants to share some message, M, right? So they have to, or the sender has to combine the secret key with the message, right? That can always be appended to the final, maybe it could be transaction or ledger that has been created. And as it's being shared, right, you can see the same happens on the receiving end. So what happens, this particular receiving computer, or rather user, needs to compare if whatever was released from the sending machine is the same as what has been shared at the end of the tunnel. When this particular hashing is performed, we normally refer to them as message authentication codes. So the codes are normally shared between the sending and the receiving computers. So when you talk about hashes, ideally we need to understand the concept of digital signatures. So when you have digital signature, it's just like the way you append your signature in a paper, right? So if you want to prove that you're the one who actually wrote this particular, let's say, document, you can always counter check with the person who actually had this particular signature. So it's the same thing. So this is what we refer to as the message authentication code. So apart from the first hash function, we also have the MD5. We also have we have mentioned about the SHA. So you can take it as a research work to look at the various hash functions. Of course, no one is going to ask you about that, but they are used to alter some given text into some integers, right? So for confidentiality, we use both the private and the public keys, right? For integrity, we normally use the hash functions, are normally captured as message authentication codes. So to reinforce our understanding, let's look at an example of how crypto is used, right? So we have agreed that security or securing data happens when two devices are communicating. It could be users that are communicating. There are some scenarios whereby also we have applications that communicate within themselves, like databases, right? When you are updating a given database, right? So where it might be used, the application, like for example in blockchain, when you are creating or initializing or rather initiating a transaction or broadcasting it, we need to use cryptography. And I was giving an example of a participating node sharing their public keys, right? And later on, maybe also sharing the private keys at some point, right? Validation of transaction, we haven't looked at this, but when miners actually want to validate a particular transaction, they are normally go through some kind of consensus algorithm. Now, these types of consensus algorithm, one example is the proof of work, right? So you can look at that later on. When the blocks have been validated and they're now appended, and that's why I was mentioning about the nonce, those particular hash numbers, right, being appended in each and every block. Ideally, to finalize the creation of a block, we normally append the hash function. In a given scenario, we'll always have two communicating devices. In our case, we have the two people, Alice and Bob, and you can see we have a channel there. We can't really tell whether it's secure, but we also have Trudy. Trudy is a bad woman, right? It's a bad woman who can be able to intercept the communication, right? Through eavesdropping, they can actually compromise confidentiality of data, integrity of data, right? And of course, even affect the availability. So Trudy is the person who will help us reinforce this concept of cryptography. So authentication is the first goal of cryptography, right? So here, Bob wants Alice to prove her identity to him. When, for example, you visit a website, forget about Bob and Alice for a moment. When you are visiting a website that is not secure, normally you might end up downloading files that are not right, or rather you might click on a link that can take you to a different website that you didn't intend to visit. All in all, what you're saying is that when you're communicating, you don't know who will actually divert your communication. So in a given communication, in a network setup, we are assuming that Alice is communicating or wants to prove to Bob, and someone that happens to be Trudy. It could be a rogue computer or rather server that intercepts this particular communication, right? So this is one step, right? So we need to reinforce the security. This is what we're just saying. These are steps. These are things that normally happens. And in our case, we are looking at it from the protocols, because protocol are the way communication is governed, right? So in our first scenario, protocol 1 is not giving us the right security. So we can give it another try, protocol 2. Now, the protocol now appends additional information. Like, for example, if two computers are communicating over the internet, we normally use the IP addresses, right? And when they're sharing the message there, we share the message in terms of packets. So if we are reminded in our network class that packets constitutes of different features, like we can have the source address, can also have the destination address, we can also append the packet headers and so on. You know the story. So all these can reinforce security to some point, right? But so if Alice wants to accept or want to know, if Bob wants to know that it's Alice that is sending, what Bob needs to do is just to check at the packet information, and it will tell Bob that this particular packet, the origin is Alice's computer, which is good to reinforce security. But still there's a challenge, right? Still there's a challenge. Trudy can create a similar packet and convince Bob that she's the one who has sent this particular message. So this happens through spoofing, right? Where you redirect or you give someone, as if it is email, something similar at your email. If you're replying to an email, you reply to non-existing email, right? So it's the same thing. So if Bob wants to communicate to Alice, he can reply to a different person, right? So this is not really enough security. So we go ahead and we can say Alice decides to share additional security layer, that is secret password, to prove that she's the one who is communicating with Bob. So Trudy cannot be able to know the secret password, but password is not just something that you'll rely on, right? People can hack passwords, and that's what Trudy has done, right? Using the playback attack. This is a form of attack. So recording, or rather eavesdropping into what Alice is sharing with with Bob. Now this normally happens, and that's why cryptography is very, very important. So if this one happens, additional layer of security is appended on the conversation between Alice and Bob, which locks out Trudy. So you can say now Alice sends an encrypted secret word, password, right? Which is, having encrypted password is okay, but if someone can use some tools, or rather there's some application that you can use to decrypt such kind of secret password, right? And that's exactly what Alice has done. I mean, what Trudy has done, right? So the woman in the middle has actually intercepted this particular password and decrypted it, right? So ideally, to reinforce this kind of security is what we have now been talking about, right? The introduction of maybe hash functions, the introduction of public keys, right? So Bob can always reinforce, or rather Alice can reinforce this particular communication by sharing some hash values or nonce, right? So you can say here the combination of all these, right? So the use of symmetric keys, asymmetric keys, or the use of cryptography can always reinforce what? Security between two communicating nodes. So this is just a way of applying the concept of cryptography, and we have so far seen that when you combine two different keys, we reinforce the security. When you use digital signatures, we reinforce security. And better still, when you use both the asymmetric and symmetric techniques, we can further reinforce this particular security. So yes, as I'd mentioned, someone might wonder, how do the participating nodes actually establish the shared secret key over the network? So where do we get these particular keys? Like, let's say Alice is sharing with Bob the public key. How will Bob determine that this particular public key is actually from Alice? That's what you are mentioning, right? Because even a hacker, right, can share public key, and you can use it to communicate back to the hacker. So to avoid this, the trusted intermediary is actually the key distribution center. They're the ones that normally offer this particular solution, right, between the entities. So how it goes, it's actually some steep learning curve, but it's important for us to know that. The same thing, when you're having kind of a sharing of keys, we can also look at the certifications that are offered through some given authority. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you're wondering where this particular, or how we generate these particular keys, it's based on the KDC server. So they share the keys. So it's like, once the KDC releases, if it's a private key, right, it needs, before the private key, or rather before the public key reaches to the destination, they need to authenticate to the receiver that this particular key is genuine, right? So as you can see, there's a back and forth intermediaries. So this is just a whole story, right? So Alice and Bob communicate using some kind of session key, right? But the most important thing is that we have the key distribution center that approves the use of this particular keys, right? So in cryptography class, we normally go ahead and maybe do some authentication using some files and see the origin of the key. And better still, we have the certificate authorities, right, that normally keeps records of these particular keys. Like, for example, if a particular entity if an entity requires to use a particular key, they capture their records in particular register, so that when this particular key is used, the certification authority will always know that it is Bob's key that is being used, right? And that's why they determine whether this is a private key, or this is a public key, right? So the concept of actually having both the primary and the public and the private key are being used in a symmetric and asymmetric manner for either encrypting or decrypting data is what leads to a creation of the digital signatures. So these are just an example of a certificate, right? So you can see the issuing authority captures different information, right? The issuer and so on. So this is just an example. So it has some kind of serial number, which is very unique, right, with some dates. So for example, when you look at the SSL, right, the HTTPS of a website, they normally have the expiry date, right, so that the authority should be able to renew and give valid certificates that has the right encryption keys. A digital signature, as I'd mentioned, is just a normal signature that normally append, just to enable people verify that this is the original document, so that someone cannot be able to forge this particular document. It's the same approach that is used in digital signature. And I gave an example. For example, Alice and Bob are communicating. So what happens is that if, for instance, Alice want to share some transaction or copy of transactions, right? What normally happens is that Alice has to append her private key on this particular transaction. Here is where things get a little bit different. So instead of now sharing the public key, she decides to append a private key on this particular what? Transaction, right? So what happens is that if the participating node, right, wants to see the details of this particular information, they must have the right public key that Alice had already done what? Shared previously before communication happens. And when that goes on, we can always talk about digital signatures being appended. So I think this is what I was trying to explain. So digital signatures are very good to ensure that the integrity of data is maintained, and also to ensure that participating nodes can confirm the origin of a particular data or message, right? So we also talked about non-repudiation. Digital signatures can also be used in some legal measures just to act as a proof that something or the transactions were actually from a particular person and so on. So we talked about the hash, and we said that if you create a hash, you can still use it as a digital signature. So it's quite some path: verification, creation of this particular, the encryption keys, and so on. So when you bring all this together, you realize that you can always create a unique digital signature. So there's a diagram here showing the process. So the sign of digital signature, you have some hash functions being appended. There's some verifier. In a peer-to-peer network, that is the blockchain, a verifier can always be seen as a miner who has the information so that they approve given blockchain, right? So remember, the hash algorithm is normally appended to a block before it is actually added to the blockchain link. Confidentiality I've already mentioned. Ensure that we don't disclose private information to unauthorized users. And the general idea is the use of asymmetric cryptography. So this is just a recap. We also talked about integrity, right? So we can minimize these through the use of hash functions, right? As you can see there. So Bob and Alice, they have been a good example of how nodes can be able to communicate through the network. So integrity, confidentiality, and authentication, right, is the person communicating the real person, right? So we can confirm that also again using cryptography. So when you apply the hash functions or the message authentication code, we have seen how to come up with one. Then we can always authenticate. Availability is actually a little bit hard to describe right now, but the idea is if the participating nodes can be able to see what the rest are seeing, then that is good. But if only half of them can be able to see the transaction, then there should be some given problem. And that's when some blockchain normally creates what we refer to as the forking, just to create a new blockchain together. So that is ideally some introduction or the concept of cryptography. Although, as you know, cryptography is a very wide area that requires a lot of understanding. So, to recap what you have